Dr. Nii Quarcoopome received his doctorate in African art history from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1993. In 2000, he entered the museum profession following several years of teaching at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Beginning as curator of the Arts of Africa, Pacific, and the Americas at the Newark Museum, he subsequently joined the Detroit Institute of Arts as department head of Africa, Oceania, and Indigenous Americas. He was promoted to Co-Chief Curator in 2012 and is currently member of the DIA's leadership group. Nii boasts an extensive publication record and several prestigious grants and awards, but most notably, the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities Planning and Implementation grants for his 2010 groundbreaking exhibition titled Through African Eyes, the European and African Art 1500 to the Present, which received the American Association of Museums' highest honor for overall excellence and the Detroit City Council resolution. He has wide-ranging experience consulting in African art collections and gallery reinstallation projects. For close to a decade, he served as board member and then chairperson for the West African Museums Project. His current academic focus includes issues affecting African national museums, cultural patrimony, which he will touch on a little later, and the provenance research. Ladies and gentlemen, warm Flint welcome, please, for Dr. Nii Quarcoopome.
Good afternoon. Just want to thank you all for taking the time to come here this afternoon to listen to me. And if you saw my picture on the screen, I had more hair on my head. I decided that today I needed to shave a little so I can feel more aerodynamic. And to begin, I would like to thank Director John Henry and the Flint Institute of Arts for inviting me here to speak, and also to take the opportunity to commend Dr. Hon for assembling such a fine collection of African art. For those of you who have had the opportunity to walk through the exhibition, I'm sure you have marveled at the incredible creativity of African artists. I'm sure you saw the arresting symmetry of the Bamana, of this Bamana female figure. You also saw the beautiful precision with which the artist rendered the human face as a series of concentric circles in the Eket moon mask. Then I would also like to draw attention to the striking angularity of the Senufo strainer. You can see from the side view that it is beautifully carved, by the artist. The last piece that I would like to draw attention to is this figure, where the artist playfully manipulates the human anatomy. And this Momoye figure is just incredible. And upon seeing all these beautiful works in a single collection, you probably thought about the collector's uncanny aesthetic sensibilities, his refined taste in art. And you also perhaps ask yourself what compelled him to acquire so many extraordinary pieces with such powerful, individualizing formal attributes. But besides Dr. Horn's enthusiasm for African art and his connoisseurship skills, you must have also wondered about the African artists who made these works and their fertile imagination You perhaps also asked questions that still need to be answered, like what motivated the artists to create these works? What was their intentions for creating them? What techniques and materials went into their creation? How were they used? How were the objects used by whom and in what context? And perhaps if you were curious, you must have also entertained the thoughts about how these objects were transferred from their original African cultures to Western societies, and whether the way we handle and display them in private homes and museums, as you see in the beautiful exhibition in the gallery, whether those practices on this side of the Atlantic compare or contrast sharply with those of their African owners, original African owners. My lecture explores some of the key principles, beliefs, and practices that have long guided art creation and use in traditional Africa. It also aims to reflect on the journey, the complicated journey of African art from its origins in villages and towns in Africa as tools of daily life to their elevation as priceless art in the West. The Merriam-Webster dictionary provides the Western definition of art as, and I quote, the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. And then goes on to add that the primary purpose is to please the eye. Scholars of African art would admit that the term art itself is virtually non-existent in African cultures. For example, in my native culture, the Ghana culture of Ghana, the definition of art frequently conflates the object's process or technique of creation, how it looks and how it functions. Art making and art use are at the core of the definition of art. The same can be said of the majority of peoples in sub-Saharan Africa. I must admit that there was likely some art that was created for art's sake. And also that all the artists, from the way you look, when you see this, the quality of objects that you see on the screen, there's a clear intention on the part of the artist to create works of great aesthetic merit to please the eye. Indeed, indigenous African artists were responding to the same impulses that guided Western artists, the great Western artists who are celebrated in our museums all across this nation and around the world. African artists were no different. They specialized in specific artistic genres. Some of them were sculptors, some were ceramicists, others worked textiles and jewelry, and they boast their individual art styles. Some of them, their art styles have been identified and they are now celebrated in museum collections around the world. Most importantly, I would also like to raise the fact that contrary to the long prevailing misconception about African artists, many of them were well known in their communities. They had names, they were related to families, and they were celebrated. Some garnered considerable renown, both within their communities and across wide geographic regions. And if I tell you that many of them were not even full-time artists when they created these works. Many of them were part-time artists. Some of them combined their daily farming or hunting and other vocations with the creation of art. But one of the things that guided them most importantly was the fact that they were always mindful of how their works would be viewed by their compatriots. Within their communities, they knew that people were going to criticize their works. For one artist's work to be accepted within his or her community, he or she must produce a work that conforms to the expectations of that community. The work must express the values as well as the aesthetic preferences. And that is the reason why you see works like this that are very slender, which is an attribute that is appreciated among the Bamana. Or you see a figure like this with such pronounced facial elements and contorted bodily forms, because those are the elements that people within that culture look for. The finished sculpture must embody physical attributes that makes it identifiable within that culture, and it makes it also appreciated within that culture. Many decades ago, the famous African art historian William Fagg theorized that every African culture has its own distinctive approach to sculpture. And that approach is something that every artist, every indigenous artist, at least before the 20th century, attempted to adhere to. The scholarship has come a long way. And according to Fagg, he called it the one tribe, one style. But the scholarship has now come a long way and now challenges this one jacket fits all impression of African art production, noting that artists enjoy a lot of artistic freedom in African cultures, and that they didn't feel confined to the boundaries of their own communities. That is true. However, whichever side you take on this debate, there is no doubt that ethnic styles were influential in most pre-20th century African art. And when you go through the galleries, you see why certain objects were juxtaposed with each other, either because they came from the same culture, or because they share attributes that are central to the production of sculpture in those communities. Now, the majority of African works from the pre-20th century era, at least into about 1950, that we call indigenous African art, also had a purpose behind their creation. That is the reason why most scholars say that African art is functional. That is to say that the art may be made to serve a practical or utilitarian function. So you can have a stool which provides support for a person. You can have a caryatid bowl, a bowl which can be used as a container for kola nuts in Yoruba culture. You can have the fly whisk, which is an implement that is carried by important elders among the Yaka. Or you can have this beautifully worked luba comb, in spite of the fact that it is a comb, it is also a figure, it's also figurative, and the figurative element has implications that usually people would interpret in that culture. Those secondary elements that you see, like the representation of the leopard, or the female figure, or the representation of this male figure at the top, or the female figure, are additional layers of meaning that are woven into the sculpture by the artist. For instance, when you look at this representation of the leopard, I always tell people that when I came to this country and I heard people talking about the Lion King, it made me very, very sad. Because in African culture, the lion is not king. The lion is respected as a very, very dangerous animal, very powerful. But when we talk about leadership, it's the leopard that is always associated with leadership. And the reason for that is because the leopard is not just a powerful and dangerous predator, but the leopard has got so much powers of restraint in spite of its powers. A leopard can stalk you for hours. If you haven't seen that before, please watch National Geographic. And will decide not to strike. Will stalk you for hours. And then when it decides to strike, for heaven's sake, you have nowhere to go. Because that leopard can climb a tree, can swim, and can run faster than many animals that you know. And that is the reason why in African culture, we relate the power of the king, who has the power over life and death, to that of the leopard. And we say the king is the leopard because the king is not just a powerful person, he also has to have that power to restrain himself from exercising that power. And then on top of it all, he also can run fast. Whether you like it or not, he can come after you when he wants it. So you have elements that, these are the embellishments that you see around, a work of art, including even the representation of beautiful beadwork around that throne. It's in the Detroit Institute of Art. And the beadwork itself are beads that were accumulated from the trade with Europeans and are expressions of the wealth of the court. So you see the layers of meaning in just a single object. From a simple support that a king can sit on, it turns into an expression of the ideology of leadership itself. And then you have the female figure. This female figure is not an ordinary female figure. She is nude and she is kneeling down. And kneeling is an expression of submission. And in Yoruba culture, when you walk into a powerful person's home, more often than not, that person would have a caryatid female figure like that, a bowl like that, that contains kola nuts. Kola nuts are red nuts that are very, very bitter. But if you drink beer, you might want to try kola nuts and beer. Because it turns, very, very bitter beer into very sweet drink because of the bitterness of the kola nuts and the bitterness of the liquor. What is interesting is that kola nuts are associated with hospitality. So when you walk into a home, the owner of the piece will give you half of the kola nuts. It breaks into two halves. And then he chews half and you chew the other half. And that is the ultimate expression of hospitality. The person is welcome into your home. The person eats the same thing that you are eating. And there is no fear that that person is going to ever poison you. But then there are works of art like this that are also utilitarian forms, like this beautiful door lock. Usually when people see this, you encounter this in the gallery, and people tell you it's a door lock, you don't realize it until you see it here. You see the same lock that is here. And among the Dogon and related peoples of Mali, you can see how a piece like this, added to a door that is covering the entrance into a granary, would have special meaning. And this is a male and female figure, so it just tells you that if you have the ancestors, the images of ancestors represented on the door, that representation is clearly indicating that these ancestors are protecting the granary, which is the source and sustenance of a family. The interesting thing about it is that every owner of a granary would have a door lock on this door. But the interesting thing about this is how elaborately it is carved. And that also goes, it gives credit. We have to give credit to Dr. Hong for selecting this piece out of perhaps many that he saw. But what is interesting about it is that you have to distinguish between this piece and simpler forms that have no figurative element at all. Once you see a figurative element, you know that there is an additional meaning, which gives it symbolic purpose, in addition to the utilitarian or practical purpose of the piece. Then you have objects like this, which is a caryatid stool, showing a female figure, carrying the upper section of the stool. Under normal circumstances, such a stool should have been something that people will sit on. But the representation of the female figure clearly shows that the female is barely carrying the weight of the whole stool. And you see how the hands are also carved, barely touching the base of the seat. This is an example of it in its real form. It's in original form. You see how it is wrapped at the bottom? You see remnants of the wrapper are still evident on this piece, which is also in the Detroit Institute of Art. But this tells you that this is no longer a tool that was made to serve any practical function. It's now been elevated. It's now been elevated to a symbol. And that is the reason why you have an elder carrying it on a special occasion, perhaps to perform particular rituals associated with it among the Hemba. Now, I would like also to draw your attention to the fact that art is sometimes, in Africa, art is created to serve transactional functions, which means that it becomes a tool for negotiating relationships with spirits. Among the Yoruba people of Nigeria, before the 20th century, Europeans who interacted with the Yoruba people were quick to notice that they made a lot of twins. We don't know whether it's in the water or the food or something special in their DNA, but they were good at making twins. And so you have lots of twin births. But when you have so many twin births, and at a time when the system of medical practice was not very good, many of the twins ended up passing away. In Yoruba culture, twins hold a very, very special place. They believe that twins are like demigods. When you have twins, you've brought into the world double fortune or double misfortune, depending very well on how well you treat the twins. If they pass away, you go, as the parent of the twin, the biological parents will go to a diviner who would ask them to commission a sculpture like this, sculptures like this. And in this case, these are two twins who passed away. The sculptures are supposed to act as an abode for the spirit of the twins. And they are treated like live human beings, like live children. They are washed and cleaned and decorated. And that is the reason why you have the mother of twins here carrying two of them in hand, while carrying a baby in the back. Sometimes one of the twins will still be alive, and so will get to play with the sculpture that is created for his or her sibling. But one of the things that you will also note is that the original sculpture that was given to the parents at the time the artist handed it over to them was a plain sculpture. But over the years, that plain sculpture gets to be decorated. You can see the beadwork around the neck. Sometimes you have beads around the waist. And the beadwork sometimes reflect the cult affiliation of the deceased queens if they were to be still alive. And then, sometimes, if the parents happen to be very, very wealthy, you get the figures and clothed in beautiful beadwork, which is also an expression of the wealth of the family. In this case, you can see how old the twin figures were kept in the family, and you can see how much dirt accumulates on them. And then the headgear is usually decorated with indigo dye. And the indigo dye is an expression of the fact that these have twin figures that have been carefully, ritually sanctioned to receive spiritual energy. So they become abodes for their twins. But this is what is interesting here. These are the pieces that you see in the exhibition. They look beautiful as sculptures, but they run out of everything. All the decorative elements, the embellishments that you see in some of these figures have disappeared. And that is one of the issues that I want to draw your attention to as we go through this lecture. The fact that some of these sculptures that come to the West become totally different in the sense that some of their physical attributes are taken away before they reach museum collections. The next thing that you find in the collection is this amazing ritual staff. It is a staff that would have been used by a priestess of the Yoruba thunder deity known as Shango. And you can see here the double axe motif, which you see in Shango shrines and on Shango-related objects frequently. And the double axe motif is just an expression of the power of the deity. The thunder deity is considered very, very powerful, very benevolent, gives riches, but it's also a very violent deity. And if you see this in the case, it looks so lonely. It's totally covered with plexiglass, beautiful lighting on it, and it looks gorgeous. I don't want you to get me wrong. It's amazing. You get to enjoy the work of art. But the bottom line is that when you see a picture of this, like this, and you see a similar one in the hand of a priestess dancing with it, it immediately communicates very powerful meaning and additional, it gives additional understanding for this particular work of art. The priestess dances with it on ceremonial occasions, and the staff is said to represent a possessed priestess. And when priestesses are possessed in the Shango ceremony, their eyes begin to bulge. So when you go into the gallery, please look very carefully at the bulging eyes, which is an expression of somebody in a state of possession. This priestess, as she dances, eventually will slow down. And when she slows down, that's when the spirit enters her. And according to the Yoruba, carrying the staff and dancing with it is what actually allows the priestess to be possessed by the spirit. So you can tell right away that the staff is not just a simple staff. It has a transactional function, negotiating the relationship with that spirit. Has fascinated many enthusiasts of African art is the corpus of works of art that are called the power figures. These are power figures. This one is in the exhibition, this one is in the exhibition, these two are from the Detroit Institute of Arts. Power figures are figures that were made to serve as containers for very, very powerful material. And once the material is put into these figures, and you see signs of it, evidence of it, each of these has got a small hole in the abdomen. You see a small hole in the abdomen, a small hole in the abdomen, each one is filled up completely. This one still has some of that power material in it. The sculpture is first created by an artist, but the artist will hand the sculpture over to a medicine man or somebody who is a specialist in creating these works. The materials that are packed into the tummy are materials taken from the world of herbs, animal blood, animal elements, some river dirt, elements from the world of waters, as well as great dirt. The material itself is inert until you have the proper verbal incantations. And when you have the verbal incantations, you can control the spiritual force in it. And each one was made to perform specific tasks. And as you can see, they vary in the way they are decorated. You see that this one looks very, very, very simple, nothing dramatic around it, but the power material is packed in the head and a little bit of it inside the stomach, and then it has the wrapper around it. This very, very small one, in fact, it's just about the size of my hand, has got all the elements, including the nails that go into it. And this would have been perhaps something that was personal to the owner. It wasn't something that was owned by a family like this one. This one, which is the granddaddy of all, was owned perhaps by a whole community. And according to the younger people who created this work, figures like this are figures that not only provided protection, but they were also witnesses to important transactions. So if you and I are having difficulties, we have a dispute over land, we will be called to stand before the figure. And in front of that figure, we'll resolve the issue, and then we'll swear an oath to abide by the results of the resolution. If one of us decides to go against the resolution, the spiritual force in it will come after you. The figure doesn't need to walk. That's what I call electronic power in Africa. And people live in fear of these because these are pieces that were highly respected. And you can tell from the number of nails on the figure, because every time a transaction took place in front of the figure, a nail will be driven into the body. And that nail becomes a testament to the transaction. The bigger the nail, sometimes the bigger the issue that came before this inquisition. The fact that the figure has got such a large accumulation of nails is a clear indication of the history of this figure as an effective controller of, or effective vehicle of social control in that culture. Then, recently we got this from a local collector, Margaret Dumont, who passed away. You can tell that this piece has been stripped of many of its accoutrements. The wrapper around the waist has been taken away, and so many other elements are no longer there. It used to have mud around the chin. We only have traces of it. This one comes as the full enchilada. It comes loaded with all the original elements. And pieces like this, like all the others, were kept indoors and brought out only occasionally. Sometimes women, sometimes children, were not allowed to see them all at all. But some of them, like this piece with all its elements intact, became patently dangerous to handle. So much so that these brackets were used to carry them from place to place. And I'm talking, this is serious business. The only problem here that we have, or rather, I don't call it a problem, the blessing that we have is that we don't have the verbal incantations to control the powers in them. So the powers in them are inert, and those that have lost the power material, of course, cannot function like they did originally. This is all indicative of the fact that when art is created in Africa, the artist is well aware that throughout the lifespan of that artwork, it is going to be transformed by additional elements that the owner chooses to apply to it. And that is something that is fundamental. Certain works remain the same, but the artist is well aware that that is also likely to happen. And that usually happens with ritual objects. And this is where you see another such object that I consider one of the most beautiful and most consequential objects in the Hunt collection. It is a ritual stool that came from the Dogon. The Dogon people are well known in West Africa as great sculptors. This is the kind of environment in which a piece like this would have been housed. So it would have been one of many pieces in this particular location. But one of the things that you find common to these two objects is that both of them have got an accumulation of ritual material on them. This coating is not coating that came about overnight. It is coating that was accumulated over a long period of time. Objects like this that are considered to be very important ritual objects will usually be coated with animal blood, because animal is slaughtered on top of them. You have not just animal blood, but also porridge. You have egg yolk. There are herbs that are also thrown on them. These these elements get accumulated over a long period of time to the point where, they literally obliterate the true form of the piece. If you are looking for clarity of form in these pieces, then you're looking in the wrong places. It took a long time for Western collectors to really begin to appreciate these works. Among the Dogon and related peoples, they call the power that accumulates as a result of these ritual, coatings over a long period of time. They call it nyama. And nyama is something that is like essence. It acquires more essence with more use, with more ritual materials that are poured on it on ritual occasions, and the repetitions of incantations and prayers on it. That piece becomes loaded with energy. And so what you have here in the gallery is a very powerful object. If it had remained, it would have been a powerful object in the hands of the Dogon if it had remained there. But somehow it ended up on this side. And you can also see that these very gorgeous sculptures are in the process of getting, receiving their own accumulation of coatings. And that is considered extremely important in the history of the life of the object. And that is very, very important. Then there are sculptures too that are made to, they are not really as important as the material that they protect. This figure here, these two figures, the Buddhist figure here and this one, are considered what we call reliquary guardian images. They guard the relics of ancestors. And I brought this photograph here. It's an old photograph, so bear with me. But these are made from tree bark. They are boxes, cylindrical boxes that are made from tree bark. And they each contain the long bones and the skull of an ancestor. So the figure is stuck on top of the box. When you go into the gallery, take a good look at this piece. There is what appears to be a third leg. It's a protuberance from the backside of the figure. That protuberance is not a seat. It's actually intended to stick into a hole. That is a hole that is right on top of this. So it sticks in it, and it protects the contents of the box. So what happens when you look through the auction catalogs? Hardly do we have an auction in the U.S. and you don't, and you don't get one of these on sale, and they are very, very expensive. But you have to ask yourself, what happened to the bones? Of course, we have one or two people who collected plaster bones. I don't know who does that. But it just tells you that many of these sculptures that you see, that look fantastic, are all part of composite forms. They weren't standing by themselves. They are part of composite forms that together make up the object. But somehow the object got dismembered. They took a portion out of it. And this brings me to something that I've always decried in my field: the tendency for collectors and museums to privilege sculpture. So when something has got a sculptural component, when they collect the sculpture and leave the rest. So sometimes it takes somebody doing field work to discover the true nature of that piece, the full piece, and that is something that we need to really work on. Then we come to the most exciting part of the lecture, if I've been boring you all this while. And it is that portion that is exciting, because frequently when people talk about masquerade, they think only about the disguising of the face with something. But masks in Africa are part of masquerades. So the mask itself that you see here, you have a beautiful example here. The mask by itself is totally useless. You need the costume to go with it. In addition to the costume, you also need the musical accompaniment. You need to see the mask in performance. The gestures have meaning. The dance has got a social importance attached to it. Even the utterances of the person who wears the mask is sometimes considered extremely important. Largely because in African culture, they don't look forward to seeing the mask. They look forward to seeing the masquerade. Because the interaction between the person who wears the mask and the public is also considered to be an aspect of it. The theatrical nature of it is considered an important element in it. And some masks are considered extremely important because of their religious and other ideological significance attached to them. This one called KIFWEBE is part of a masquerade that some people believe started at the turn of the 20th century among the SONGYE and related populations. In fact, when you look on the back of the catalog, what you see on the back of the catalog and also at the entrance of the exhibition is the Luba variation on this form. So you're actually looking at two different cultures, but approaching the same tradition differently. But one of the things that you find with regard to the KIFWEBE is this really interesting rendition of the human face with a flat nose, a protruding mouth, big eyes, and lines on the face. And when you see the mask in the gallery, it looks lonely and totally without costume. And I don't blame Dr. Horn for collecting it. It's a beautiful work of art. But the missing element here is the costume. And you can see that the costume, with the costume, it looks a little bit more daunting to look at. It's frightening, and it has its own reasons for being a very, very frightful, scary piece. It is used by the secret society to control society in various ways. According to some scholars, it was used in boys' coming of age ceremonies. Some people also have claimed that it was used to counter the dangerous effects of witchcraft in society. So there is a whole lot that is associated with it. One of the things that you have to keep in mind, though, is that when people wear masks of this nature, especially masks that are considered to have a spiritual component, the masker, as we call them, is no longer himself when he wears the mask. He becomes somebody else. Sometimes he takes on attributes of that spirit. And so a mask can chase some of the members of the audience and flog them, and do all kinds of things. And after it's over, the masker does not remember what happened. So there are all kinds of things that are associated with masks. And you find a similar one, like this beautiful piece in the exhibition. And I want to draw your attention to the white paint around the eyes, which you see here, the white paint. See the white paint here, and then the pointed hat, which is all part of the physical attributes that have come to be associated with masquerade like this. Imagine if the mask was installed with the full regalia on it. I'm sure the little kids will love it, but they will have nightmares anyway. But it just tells you how much we're missing when we come to the museum. And museums are doing everything. And you see, later on this lecture, how much museums are trying so hard to see whether they could even capture a little bit of these things. Sometimes with big video screens, we have a huge video screen at the DIA where you see the people dancing the mask, literally kicking the dust into the faces of the little kids. Then they stand there in total amazement. But that is the kind of thing that you don't see in the museum environment. You don't see the actual thing happen. And seeing this, and then you see another one, which is the KPLEKPLE mask from the BAULE. You can see that here it is a single piece of wood. But look at the amazing, amazing decoration of it, with the raffia costume. It's a little bit more engaging than when it is installed in this way. And then you have all these people. You can even see the number of people wearing the blue and white cloth around their waist, which is an indication that this is an important solemn occasion, because blue and white cloth is usually associated with ancestral presence. So the mask is no longer just another person dancing, and dancing in front of the crowd with a mask, a sculpture on their faces, but it's something that is respected because the masker is no longer himself. It is the spirit that is now manifesting itself through the person wearing the mask. Are you following me so far?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now, not every mask is made to represent spirits or to represent the manifestation of spirits. In some cultures like the GURO and the BAULE, as we'll see later on, masks are also made to honor individuals. They are made for entertainment. And Dr. Horn has got a fantastic example of this entertainment mask, this one from the GURO. And you can see that a slightly younger one has got the face paint, and you can see the painted face. Usually the face is always that of a female. And the female is not just an abstract female, but a female who was known in that culture and who is being celebrated for accomplishments that have been attributed to her. But one of the things that you find among the GURO and BAULE is that even though the mask is said to embody all the attributes of beauty, you can still see that no two of them look alike. And the reason for that is because the artist adds scars, keloidal scars, in specific areas that mimic those of the person being honored, as a way to individualize the mask, even though it is celebrating her beauty and people look at it as a beautiful mask. They also know that the mask is representing one particular individual in the community, somebody who has gained status and has been affirmed as an accomplished individual. You see, in this particular mask, and this is a very, very interesting example, because the mask in this case from the BAULE was collected in the field by a scholar who took pains to document it carefully. And in this case, we have the name of the artist, Owikimu, and then we also have the name of the person who was honored by the mask. And here, this old lady, who is called Moya Yanso, was the one who was honored by the mask. It was her husband who commissioned the mask from the artist. And for much of her life, as a married woman, every time the mask performs, that old lady, who, when she was younger, danced next to the mask as a way to show her appreciation for the great honor that is being bestowed on her by society. And here you see her sitting down with her stepson. The husband has passed away, but I think it was shortly after the mask, shortly after this photograph that the mask was collected and brought to the West. But it came without, this is the masking performance. It came without the costume. It came without the music. It came without the people. So, all we have going for us is the mask. So, in situations like this, putting all the three of them together makes a lot of sense. Then we have masks that are just made from textiles. The Egungun mask is a mask that is performed among the Yoruba, and Egungun masks are usually made from textiles. You can see the dominance of red, which is the special color for the ancestors. Here you have one individual here, one here, and then there's the third one here. But some of the Egungun masks had a sculptural component on top of it. And that sculptural component became the target for collectors. So you have here, one that was taken off the original, mask. But in Yoruba culture, it is these costumes that are considered far more important than the sculpture. But here in the West, we go for the sculpture and leave. It's like throwing the baby out and taking the placenta home. Now we have, museums collecting some of these masks, and some of them come no longer with their sculptural component. This is a piece that I found in West Africa in one of the art markets, and I bought it and gave to the DIA. But it just tells you how much premium we put on sculpture and how that is also distorting what comes into the West and is defined as African art. Then you have to ask yourself, once the objects get to the West, what happens? We have this sculpture here, it's in the catalog, but it's not in the exhibition. This is the environment in which a sculpture like that was used. You can see on the sculpture, residues of the ritual coating that was used on the sculpture. Here you see similar ones with porridge on them. You see, perhaps animal blood. This is a similar one that we have at the DI, now locked behind a glass case, enjoying its own environment. We check the humidity in that case regularly to make sure that it is breathing well. And every small flake that falls of it, we take it out to the conservation department for them to make sure that if it is not something that we can reattach, we reinforce the leftover space over there so that it doesn't fall off again, another one doesn't fall off. The same thing applies to this beautiful flag. You have flags that were used among the Fanti. The Fanti people use these flags to dance, and to dance on ceremonial occasions. We have what we call Asafo. The Asafo are military companies among the Fanti, and they came into contact with Europeans all the way back from the 1500s up to the present, and so they've had a long history of European influence on their culture. They adopted the flag because they saw Europeans taking flags into combat, and so the flag became associated with these military companies known as Asafo. Now that the Asafos are no longer fighting wars, they've become entertainment societies, and so they use the flags to dance. But here, it's behind a sad case with a glass on it, with light on it, and then the floor is so meticulously cleaned. It's such a wonderful aesthetic environment. And the West does this for good reason. I'm a museum person, so I know why we do this, because it preserves the work for a very long period of time, so that our children and our children's children will also get to see these works. But the difference is the African attitude toward these objects, and how that contrasts sharply with how we see these objects and how we decide to display them. Now, if somebody tells you, and the debate is now going on because the French president, Macron, brought up, he opened the Pandora's box when he said that he wanted African objects to be returned to their rightful owners. And I can tell you that he's right up to a point, because some of these objects that we have in museum collections are so critical to, they are like objects that bond the whole community. Some of them are so powerful. I was just telling Director John Henry that some of them, in their communities, some of the objects have the same status as the independence, whatever you call it, document that was signed If you take it out, the society disintegrates. It falls apart. It causes so much instability. And I've seen it happen over and over again when important ritual objects, important relics are taken out and sold out, or are stolen from those communities, and they end up in the West. And one of the things that people say is that, well, the Africans don't have good museums and they can't manage these objects. They can't preserve them. We are just helping to preserve these objects, for posterity and for humankind. Oh, give me a break. Look, the concept of museums, yes, Western concept of museum is Western. But Africans had their own museums long before the Europeans came to Africa. And I want to point out to you some of the things that sometimes drive me nuts. This is a group of twin figures that you find among a Yoruba, in the Yoruba family. Twin figures that were used over time and considered to have brought fortunes or good fortune to their parents, and they are kept in the family because they have good vibes around them. And so you have a whole collection by a family, and you can see the ritual implements around them. You have chalk, you have sometimes other elements that are put together as part of a family altar. For that small nuclear family or small extended family, this is their museum. You have the Lobi family altar that I showed you, with all the ritual implements and sculptures. It's not just the sculptures, but the ceramic bowls, the other implements that are all part of a very broad range of elements that work together, work hand in hand with each other to support and to protect the community. You have all of it in this little area. And families do everything they can to preserve them. They have custodians who work hard, who are very, very, very knowledgeable about how to work the spiritual energies in this to the benefit of society. And you can see from the document piece here that all of these, you have all of these pieces. Usually, when people go to collect these things, they take the sculpture and leave the rest. You have, the palace of the royal palace of Abome, and the former royal palace. Unfortunately, these are pieces that you can't take with you because they are bas reliefs that you see decorating the walls of the palace, and that's the museum. Here you have Igbo in Bray Shrine with sculptures that are made not to last. The sculptures were made intentionally to be allowed to disintegrate after they've been used. And then new ones were made later on. So there is a whole cycle of creation, destruction, it's just an amazing thing to watch. So people actually go to steal these sculptures and bring them to the West to sell. And then, at the DIA, when I joined the DIA, we had these 7 ritual posts. When I saw them on view in the gallery, in the old African gallery, they were against the white wall. And each of them was treated as a work of art, nicely spaced from each other, so that you can go there, stand in front of it, in reference to it, look at it from top to bottom, and enjoy it. And after that, you go to the next one, and on and on. But I saw these pieces, and I said, there is something about them. They all had polka dots on them. And if they have polka dots on them, from my knowledge of Yoruba art, polka dots go with the god Shango, because Shango is the god that is also considered the leopard of the sky. And polka dots are used on the bodies of his Shango's priestesses. So I decided I will look at this because I will research these pieces. And I researched, and lo and behold, I found this wonderful photograph. This photograph is of the Agbeli Shrine in Ibadan in southwestern Nigeria, and it was taken by the German explorer Leo Frobenius in 1910. And it just indicates that we have 7 out of the 14 posts in the front of this. So we decided to do this. We literally copied the facade, made it a little bit more artsy. But the arrangement of the figures is in the same sequence in which they are found in the gallery. And we had additional elements that were all associated with the god Shango. So you won't find this anywhere in the world except the DIA. I'm selling the DIA to you while I'm the FIA. But it brings us to the bigger point of how some of the arguments about the restitution of cultural property run very, very hollow because of the fact that had kingdoms like Benin continued to exist without any interruption from the British, they would have continued to make art. When Benin was conquered in 1897 by the British, what happened? When Benin was conquered, they found as many as 7,000 objects from the palace, which the British took away. And then the objects were sold on the market as indemnity for the war. Benin did not start the war, and like the Iraqi war, the West comes, does the damage, and then they want to take the art or the oil to pay for the war. Does it make sense to me? And what happened here is that in Benin, look at all the ivory tusks that were taken off. Each of them was mounted originally like this, with images on them that chronicled the reigns, events during the reign of each of the kings. So you have to ask yourself how much we are losing by dismembering these pieces, by taking them apart. And once you take the ivory of the sculpture, you've lost one chunk of history because you cannot reunite them again. And that is exactly what happened here. You have all the heads in the lower section here. Oh. You have all the heads in the lower section, and then you have all the ivories in the upper section. I call Benin and other African monarchies and their palaces the museums of their cultures. Nobody would have had the guts to walk into the palace of Benin and take any one of these objects. Nobody. Nobody would have done that. You would have had your head, you would have been beheaded so quickly you forget your last name. And then you have these pieces that you also see constantly in in museums across the world. One German museum has so many of them that they decided to try to recreate how they would have looked like in the Benin Palace, as it was described by one Danish visitor to the palace, that they lined the walls of the palace with this. So here, after the fact, they have so much that they put them out there to mimic what would have been in the Benin Palace. I think that if Benin decides to come after these pieces, they have every right to do so. These are pieces that are well documented. We have an inventory of all of them that were taken out. And I think that if somebody were to come to this country and grab the Liberty Bell and take it to Africa, I am sure that Americans will get up and say, we got to fight and get it back because of the historical significance of it, because it's symbolic. That's the same thing that is happening when it comes to African art. But I do not recommend that every piece of art from Africa be given back, because some of them were owned by people, individuals. And those people are dead and gone. And these things were traded down. So those pieces I can let go. But things that have historical significance, communal emblems and relics, those are pieces that need to go back if there is a need for us to make amends for all the evils that have been perpetuated by European nations especially. America saves itself from criticism because it wasn't part of the colonial movement. Unfortunately, objects have ended up here, and there is nothing we can do about it if some of the pieces that came here went through Europe and found their way here, or whether it was taken out of Africa directly. But the most important thing that I want to leave you with is that African art has got such a complicated history. Even the creation of African art is so complex. The materials that go into it, the colors, the individual materials and the significance they have, and the groupings of materials that are, that are inserted in objects and that are used to bake, objects. All those elements are things that we need to pay attention to, because even when you don't see anything represented on the sculpture, chances are that if that sculpture happened to be a ritual object, it has been prepared in a way that gives it invisible qualities. Those intangible elements always get lost. And the same thing applies to a mask. I want you to understand that we need to begin to understand masquerade in Africa and not masks. And so thank you so much for this. I'm available to ask and to answer questions. So if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer.
Can we assume that most of those are created by men, or some of the artists women?
Sculptures generally are created by men, but we have exceptions to that. We don't have terracotta sculptures from the Akan of Ghana. Some of the terracotta sculptures from the Akan are made by old women who have passed menopause. And there is a special reason for that, because younger women are said to be still of childbearing age if they create works of art like clay sculpture that represent people who have passed on. It might have spiritual repercussions, so they are prevented from doing so. But older women are the ones who have traditionally created sculpture. Across West Africa, you find women creating sculpture, especially those who are affiliated with ceramics. But beyond that, the carving of wood, metal sculpture, and on, those are all male-dominated vocations that sometimes you don't prevent women from doing, but some cultures actually prevent women from doing. Among the Asante, for instance, for a long time, women were not allowed to weave. But in the last 2 decades, we've seen women weaving, and some of them are proven to be super talented, and so they break in. It's not the glass ceiling longer. They just go through the roof with it, and they're doing a fantastic job. So African cultures are not static. They are very, very dynamic, and they see what is going on in the world. And so even cultures that had strictures in place that tended to keep women out of certain professions are all beginning to open up, because some of these strictures were put there for all kinds of crazy reasons, and I think people have seen through them and have decided to allow women to just be themselves and contribute to society. Yes?
You mentioned that some of the artists were part-time. In other words, they were farmers and became artists. So was it a case where farming was their primary
Yes.
They had an interest in something and maybe started making it for themselves and began selling it? Or?
Yes, that is usually the case. You have somebody who is a blacksmith, and because he creates the tools for artists to carve, he himself begins to use the tools for carving. And so it becomes a side job. And then if he proves to be very talented, society recognizes him. And then, gradually you see a slight tilt toward wood carving because it becomes so important, and he begins to receive commissions from all over the place. You have the same thing happening to people who are farmers. Maybe after working in the farm, and your farmers go out of the community into the bush to farm. Maybe he tried his hands on carving a few things and realized he had the talent to do so. And then over time, people begin to recognize the fact that he is truly somebody who can be relied upon to produce certain works. Then you also have diviners and priests. They are also very well known, in the field of art as good carvers, and they produce because they are the ones who recommend sculptures to people as solutions to spiritual problems. And so some of them become great carvers. I know one that I've worked with very, very closely. He did not even learn how to carve. His father was a carver. And he dreamt about carving works when his father passed away. And one day he was performing his rituals, and then he looked around and he saw the tools that his father used originally staring at him. And he never stopped carving. So there are stories like that, and it just tells you that the people who train to be carvers usually apprentice to be carvers. Even so, they always have another job somewhere, either working in the marketplace, or maybe doing something else, going fishing and coming back to carve works of art. So there's a lot of that, but we also learned from the late 20th century, late 19th century into the 20th century, that there were certain artists who became so renowned, within broad geographic regions, that there were people coming from all over the place. In fact, the DIA has got the works of 3 works by one artist called Olowe of Ise that we've put on view right now. He was so renowned that he was called within Yoruba society as the sculptor for kings. Every palace wanted to have a work by Olowe of Ise. And yet, Olowe was attached to only one of those palaces, and he was a messenger. But he grew to become so important in Yoruba culture. I'm sure that toward the end of his reign, and toward the end of his career, he stopped being a messenger and just devoted much of his attention to sculpting, because we have a photograph of him in 1937 that showed him standing with 2 assistants. And we also have oral literature that tells us that he had a whole workshop of artists who were training under him. So it just tells you that one can easily transform from a part-time artist to a full-time artist if the situation is right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Just wanted to say thank you for your outstanding job. Just was noticing, can you hear me?
No.
You said no. Okay, I have to use my teacher voice. I was going to say thank you for the outstanding job that you've done in sharing this art. And I was noticing that noticed a lot of the pieces, but this particular one with the comb, like maybe an afro comb or something. And I was thinking that maybe had an association with the various hairstyles and the designs, everything that the ladies wore. And then I thought about the hairstyles that the ladies are wearing here, all the designs and the braiding and the plaits. sometimes I wish that they knew more about they know about the design, but they know the history of it. And I was wondering if you could share some information on that comb, what it represented.
Yeah, combs are very, 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 I call them very sentimental objects because combs are usually commissioned by men to give to women, and they are not always, wives, mistresses, girlfriends, and all the other, classifications. And they give them to women, and usually women also treasure these things, so they are preserved for long periods of time. Among the Akan people in Ghana, we have combs that the artists, the people who commission them, want the comb to have attributes of beauty, that the Akan treasure. So when the patron of the art gives it to a girlfriend or a mistress, it's as if you are telling the mistress you are beautiful. And when you look at this sculpture, you're actually looking at yourself. And that is the reason why when you're commissioning a comb for an Akan person or for a Luba person or for a Lega, you have to know what is considered beautiful in that culture. Otherwise, it's not going to be acceptable to you. If you have a culture that takes pride in the gap in the front teeth as an attribute of beauty, if you're an artist, you must know that, and you must make sure that you emphasize that. Otherwise, it's not going to go down well, for the woman who is going to accept it. Because everybody wants to be told that, they are beautiful. And people are beautiful for a whole range of reasons. And people have to, when you are an artist, you want your work to be acceptable. So you create beautiful works, beautiful in that culture. And the combs are particularly attractive as gifts from person to person, especially from males to females. And you also find that combs at the turn of the 20th century were actually used as decorative elements among the Igbo people. So the design on the comb is also for public display, because when women comb their hair and they stuck the comb in the hair and they walk around, they don't have to say a whole lot. There is a lot that is being communicated by that comb already. That is the beauty of African art. It is symbolic too. So the practical function is there to comb the hair, but the artist and the patron come together and they talk about what should go on it. What should go on it to silently speak to whoever is willing to look at it. And sometimes you see, some of the, we have I'm doing my research right now, writing the whole manuscript on the airway, and the textiles from the airway have messages in it that were intended for the adversaries. So if you hate my guts and you go into a public setting and I have a cloth on, you look at the cloth I'm wearing, you look at the designs, and you know that I'm speaking to you. But I haven't said a word. So you have no business knocking my teeth out of my mouth. But the next thing you do is that you also commission a cloth, and you also have your message in it as a response. And usually the response goes overboard, so that the other guy will also continue. So there's a rhythm back and forth. And that is what is driving the whole, the whole society. It is such a wonderful thing. The fact that people don't fight, but they fight with art, is amazing. It makes my day. For me as an art historian, that's one of the most beautiful things that I get out of my profession. Just watching how, one person creates art and says some of the most incendiary things about, an adversary, and then when you talk to the adversary, they bring out a cloth that was in response to the other person's cloth. And now they are friends. Thank you very much.